Hello everyone, today we keep reading and commenting on the first chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. Camps, by which we mean every disposition of troops in concentrated, therefore in battle order, in contradistinction to cantonments or quarters, are a state of rest, therefore of restoration, but they are at the same time also the strategic appointment of a battle on the spot chosen, and by the manner in which they are taken up, they contain the fundamental lines of the battle, a condition from which every defensive battle starts. They are therefore essential parts of both strategy and tactics. Cantonments take the place of camps for the better refreshment of the troops. They are therefore, like camps, strategic subjects as regards position and extent, tactical subjects as regards internal organization with a view to readiness to fight. The occupation of camps and cantonments no doubt usually combines with the recuperation of the troops another object also, for example the covering a district of country, the holding a position, but it can very well be only the first. We remind our readers that strategy may follow a great diversity of objects, for everything which appears an advantage may be the object of a combat, and the preservation of the instrument with which war is made must necessarily very often become the object of its partial combinations. If therefore in such a case strategy ministers only to the maintenance of the troops, we are not on that account out of the field of strategy, for we are still engaged with the use of the military force, because every disposition of that force upon any point whatever of the theatre of war is such a use. But if the maintenance of the troops in camp or quarters calls forth activities which are no employment of the armed force, such as the reconstruction of huts, pitching of tents, subsistence and sanitary services in camps or quarters, then such belong neither to strategy nor tactics. Even entrenchments, the site and preparation of which are plainly part of the order of battle, therefore tactical subjects, do not belong to the theory of the conduct of war so far as respects the execution of their construction, the knowledge and skill required for such a work being, in point of fact, qualities inherent in the nature of an unorganized army. The theory of the combat takes them for granted. Amongst the subjects which belong to mere keeping up of an armed force, because none of the parts are identified with the combat, the victualling of the troops themselves comes first, as it must be done almost daily and for each individual. Thus it is that it completely permeates military action in the parts constituting strategy. We say parts constituting strategy because during a battle the subsistence of troops will rarely have any influence in modifying the plan, although the thing is conceivable enough. The care for the subsistence of the troops comes therefore into reciprocal action chiefly with strategy, and there is nothing more common than for the leading strategic features of a campaign and war to be traced out in connection with a view to this supply. But however frequent and however important these views of supply may be, the subsistence of the troops always remains a completely different activity from the use of the troops, and the former has only an influence on the latter by its results. The other branches of administrative activity which we have mentioned stand much further apart from the use of the troops. The care of sick and wounded, highly important as it is for the good of an army, directly affects it only in a small portion of the individuals composing it, and therefore has only a weak and indirect influence upon the use of the rest. The completing and replacing articles of arms and equipment, except so far as by the organism of the forces it constitutes a continuous activity inherent in them, takes place only periodically and therefore seldom affects strategic plans. We must, however, here guard ourselves against a mistake. In certain cases, these subjects may be really of defensive importance. The distance of hospitals and depots of munitions may very easily be imagined as the sole cause of very important strategic decisions. We do not wish either to contest that point or to throw it into the shade, but we are at the present occupied not with the particular facts of a concrete case, but with abstract theory. And our assertion, therefore, is that such an influence is too rare to give the theory of sanitary measures and the supply of munitions and arms an importance in theory of the conduct of war, such as to make it worthwhile to include in the theory of the conduct of war the consideration of the different ways and systems which the above theories may furnish, in the same way as is certainly necessary in regard to victualling troops. If we are clearly understood the results of our reflections, then the activities belonging to war divide themselves into two principal classes, into such as are only preparations for war, and into the war itself. This division must therefore also be made in theory. The knowledge and applications of skill in the preparations for war are engaged in the creation, discipline, and maintenance of the military forces. What general names should be given to them we do not enter into, but we see that artillery, fortification, elementary tactics as they are called, the whole organization and administration of the various armed forces, and all such things are included. But the theory of war itself occupies itself with the use of these prepared means for the object of the war. It needs of the first only the results, that is, the knowledge of the principal properties of the means taken in hand for use. This we call the art of war, in a limited sense, or theory of the conduct of war, or theory of the employment of armed forces, all of them denoting for us the same thing. The present theory will therefore treat the combat as the real contest, marches, camps, and cantonments, as circumstances which are more or less identical with it. The subsistence of the troops will only come into consideration like other given circumstances in respect to its results, not as an activity belonging to the combat. The art of war, thus viewed in its limited sense, divides itself again into tactics and strategy. The former occupies itself with the form of the separate combat, the latter with its use. Both connect themselves with the circumstances of marches, camps, cantonments, only through the combat, and these circumstances are tactical or strategic according as they relate to the form or the signification of the battle. No doubt there will be many readers who will consider superfluous this careful separation of two things lying so close together as tactics and strategy, because it has no direct effect on the conduct itself of war. We admit certainly that it would be pedantry to look for direct force on the field of battle from a theoretical distinction, but the first business of every theory is to clear up conceptions and ideas which have been jumbled together and, we may say, entangled and confused. And only when a right understanding is established as to names and conceptions can we hope to progress with clearness and facility, and be certain that author and reader will always see things from the same point of view. Tactics and strategy are two activities mutually permeating each other in time and space, at the same time essentially different activities, the inner laws and mutual relations of which cannot be intelligible at all to the mind until a clear conception of the nature of each activity is established. He to whom all this is nothing must either repudiate all theoretical consideration, or his understanding has not as yet been pained, but confused and perplexing ideas resting on no fixed point of view, leading to no satisfactory result, sometimes dull, sometimes fantastic, sometimes floating in vague generalities, which we are often obliged to hear and read on the conduct of war, owing to the spirit of scientific investigation having hitherto been little directed to these subjects. So today we complete basically the first chapter that deals in distinguishing those elements that pertain to the conduct of war proper compared to the preparation of war, and in this sense also the relations that stand between tactics and strategy that we have begun the last time, right? We had concluded with explaining marches. Now von Clausewitz talks about camps and so on. And he writes, camps, by which we mean every disposition of troops in concentrated, therefore in battle order, in contradistinction to cantonments better, or quarters, are a state of rest, therefore of restoration. But they are, at the same time, also the strategic appointment of a battle on the spot chosen. And by the manner in which they are taken up, they contain the fundamental lines of the battle, a condition from which every defensive battle starts. They are therefore essential parts of both strategy and tactics. This is particularly important because we will see now, even with cantonments, what's the difference at the end of the day. The camp is much more out there, right, on the front, on the first line, and it's meant naturally to make the troops rest and restore themselves, but at the same time, it's camps are oriented towards the battle, right? Both tactically and strategically, because as camps, they naturally have this imminent defensive character that has to do with naturally also eventual attacks, but they also are located somewhere on the map, let's say, and therefore they decide effectively where the battle is going to take place. I mean, in the nearby, fundamentally. So in here there are both tactical and strategical elements, and still we're talking about something that has in fact an eminently military nature, right? It has to do with combat, which is here what in the conduct of war von Clausewitz is interested in. Then cantonments, instead, he writes, take the place of camps for the better refreshment of the troops. They are therefore, like camps, strategic subjects as regards position and extent, tactical subjects as regards internal organization with a view to readiness to fight. So cantonments are something similar, right? That are let's say, suited for a better refreshment of the troops. So they're normally more far from the battlefield, but they still have a strategic importance in the measure in which where they are located. Also tactical, because maybe in the way they are structured, they are functional to how troops have to put themselves in formation in order, so they're functional to that as well. But now we'll see how they differ a little bit more from the camps, because in actual fact it's not even so easy to draw precisely the difference between camps and cantonments in terms of when we're talking about real encampments at the end of the day. But there is this important distinction, because von Clausewitz says the occupation of camps and cantonments no doubt usually combines with the recuperation of the troops another object also. For example, the covering a district of country, the holding a position. But it can be very well be only the first, right? So he basically says it may be, and this is more in the situation of cantonments, I believe, I mean, evidently actually, the fact that this encampments can have only the function of making troops resting, right? So they can have this also strategic value, for example, of controlling a territory, a region, right? But they can also be just kind of a logistical base, a resupplying area, whatever, making the troops recovering, right? And here von Clausewitz writes, we remind our readers that strategy may follow a great diversity of objects, for everything which appears an advantage may be the object of combat. And the preservation of the instrument with which war is made must necessarily very often become the object of its partial combinations, right? So basically you have to read and this is a bit where, in fact, there are certain challenges that, for example, I met, for example, when I was writing about the value of certain, what to which extent is any kind of location in general tactical, let's say tactically or strategically meant, right? Because there's a debate relatively to this, and we could be relatively picky about it, but telling the truth, every kind of place can be exploited, both tactically and strategically. And always remember that tactics and strategy are always together, in the sense they're intertwined, right? It depends, I would say, on mostly what you are up to at the moment, meaning that certain things remain always present at the same time, but this is nature of war in itself. You can't really distinguish tactics and strategy at the very and if you remember at the end of the chapter, as well, I was reading that von Clausewitz explains this and says, why distinguish it if it is so, but because it's important to have a conceptual clarity about certain things, and how, if anything, in order to understand better how these objects work, right? It's not because it's evident that it's so difficult to understand what's the tactical strategical value of an encampment, but at that point it depends also on the situation, and that's what, if you have a clarity, if it's clear what this is for in general, in theory, you can understand better how to make certain choices and how to distinguish, because at the end of the day, that's, if you remember at the end, in fact, von Clausewitz even writes, that this is important, because otherwise you can't have a theory on which to build even practice, right? And there are certain explanations of war that exclude this concept, but these are all very important to clarify everything. So von Clausewitz goes on and writes, if, therefore, in such a case strategy ministers only to the maintenance of the troops, we are not on that account of the field of strategy, for we are still engaged with the use of the military force, because every disposition of that force upon any point whatever of the theater of war is such a use. So what is meaning here is that, when you're talking, for example, about the maintenance of the troops, think about supplies, right? Or the substance, I renounced it. I had difficulties even when I was reading it. But we'll read it later, so I will be challenged once again to repeat it. Subsistence, yeah, I made it, of the troops in general, right? Whichever thing you're talking about food, about weapons, about medical care, and all this stuff, right? While you're organizing them, you are not, let's say, at the you're not outside the military sphere, as long as this naturally has an impact on the theater of war, right? It's obvious that you have to organize your forces and to administer your resources accordingly to also what use you're going to make of them, because and that use is going to influence directly the military employment as well. We have partly clarified this in the first part. Now von Clausewitz explains a little better, and in fact he writes, but if the maintenance of the troops in camp or quarters calls forth activities which are no employment of the armed force, such as the construction of huts, pitching of tents, subsistence, once again I flipped, and sanitary services in camps or quarters, then such belong neither to strategy nor tactics. So what does this mean? It's a very theoretical distinction, but in fact this is the chapter on the theater of war, right? Here it really means that all what pertains to, in a way, the ability and the capability of constructing huts, from a theoretical point of view, pitching of tents, subsistence, and sanitary services, or camps or quarters, do not belong to the military sphere proper, right? it's the same example we were doing the other time about here. Every Boy Scout, let's assume, can build a hut or pitching up tents. Every doctor, every civilian doctor, of course, can can provide sanitary services in camps or quarters. But this hasn't to do theoretically by itself, enucleating it by itself with the military sphere. Then the doctor, maybe he's a military doctor and therefore he's trained to fight just as any other soldier. But while he's performing certain services, he is definitely not doing anything military in that sense. Of course, healing a soldier is going to have a military a consequence in the military sphere, but there's still separated spheres. This is what von Clausewitz is explaining, right? And it's very easy to understand, actually. It doesn't take very much. So here it goes on and says, even entrenchments, the site and preparation of which are plainly part of the order of battle, therefore tactical subjects, do not belong to the theory of the conduct of war so far as respects the execution of their construction, the knowledge and skill required for such work being, in point of fact, qualities inherent in the nature of an organized army. The theory of the combat takes them for granted, right? So, also in here, entrenchments. Like entrenchments, think about World War I. It seems it's all about trenches, right? Because that's trench warfare. Yet, what pertains to the ability of creating trenches is intrinsically not military, right? It's obvious that these trenches are built in a fashion that is meant to serve the purpose of a tactical purpose, a strategical purpose, but in themselves they can be done elsewhere. And here the most important thing that von Clausewitz says is that, in fact, it's not even it's something that the army takes for granted. Right, it's something that the theory of war takes for granted for when it concerns combat, because combat already thinks that there is a trench in there, right? I know it sounds theoretical, but it's important to make the distinction, to realize, in fact, that there are certain characters of war that, in fact, do depend on elements that are not military. Like the ability of the knowledge, know-how to build a trench. Even if evidently those trenches are gonna be built with a kind of, at least of military direction, because it's the military man that has to choose at that point how to and how to build it and what for, right? And somehow there are things that are probably here, maybe I'm going a bit too far, but I think that von Clausewitz is also preparing us a little bit for the concept of the homogeneity of how wars are really fought, meaning that, in fact, building a trench, it's not a big deal, because building trenches is what armies have been capable to do literally throughout all military history, right? There's never been an army in the world has not been able to build a trench. So that's the point of the story. Like that's something that armies basically build in a kind of automated fashion, at the point that you can put some effort into that, but it's really something that's going to happen anyway. Like, even if you take World War I, for example, like the first trenches, as you know, at the beginning of the war, they didn't think that war would go on that way, basically. But the first trenches were built literally from the craters that were formed by the shells, like the cannon, the bombardments, right? So they first, under fire, it's a big hole in the ground. That's where we're gonna take shelter, right? And there are also different types of trenches, but let's say that things kind of begin even just with natural, for example, natural terrain characteristics, right? It's like building up little little walls, right, with I don't know, with sandbags or with stones and stuff like that. It's really the same concept, like huts and other shelters. That's what troops have to be trained for, but that essentially have also kind of a natural function. They're naturally known. I explain myself poorly, but I hope you get at least what I'm saying. And here, von Clausewitz goes on and says, amongst the subjects which belong to the mere keeping up of an armed force, because none of the parts are identified with the combat, the victualling of the troops themselves comes first, as it must be done almost daily and for each individual, right? So there are these elements that pertain not to the military sphere, that however have evident strong ties with the individual combatants, like every single day, like feeding the combatants is like one of the first things in war ever, but that still doesn't pertain to the military in theory. I mean, it doesn't pertain to the military theory, let's say better. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, this is thus it is that it completely permeates military action in the parts constituting strategy. We say parts constituting strategy because during battle the subsistence, here we go again, of the troops will rarely have any influence in modifying the plan, although the thing is conceivable enough, right? So what does this mean is that, for example, feeding the troops is pretty damn important. Think about the first Battle of the Marne, all the problem the Germans had in order to supply their lines, well, the more they were approaching to Paris, and supply chains were getting too stretched. I can't say even Operation Barbarossa, you know, and all the outstretched German advances, let's say that. Well, that is a big deal, because literally the thing failed mostly because of, obviously because of the supplies, right? So what is interesting is that that's such a vital need, but it doesn't pertain to the theory of war. It pertains to the theory of something else, of logistics, even of cooking, I would say, obviously, right? And funding the resources and so on. There are all things that have practically nothing to do with the theory of war, but still permeate the military action. So they do have a massive impact on strategy, which is evident, but it's still something out of it, right? It has to do with the preparation of war, not really with the conduct of war. Here is what von Clausewitz is trying to isolate conceptually to make us understand better how the two things, in fact, work differently. So von Clausewitz goes on and writes, the care for the subsistence, I made it to spell it correct, pronounce it correctly, here I went again, the subsistence of the troops comes therefore into reciprocal action, chiefly with strategy, and there is nothing more common than for the leading strategic features of a campaign and war to be traced out in connection with a view to this supply, right? So this is important, mostly from strategy, right? With tactics, it's not a big deal, because obviously soldiers, say, can eat even during combat. It does happen all the time, actually. But it's evidently mostly a strategical problems, right? The guy doesn't really fight any better if, between a moment of the battle, a battle or another, let's say a clash and another, he hits his neck, right? That can make him feel slightly better because of, I don't know, glycemia and all this stuff, but doesn't consistently alter his combat capabilities, unless it's not drugs or something. But drugs, even this has been a bit too overestimated, the importance of drugs in terms of tactical, of combat effectiveness, because really I would have to make a video about that. But it's evident that instead it has, as we already said, a massive impact on strategy, right? All the supply chain, all the stocks, and all how they have to arrive to the front, the warehouses, the depots, and so on. So that's a big thing that consumes a really big part of the whole strategic conduct at the end of the day. But it's still not part of it. This is the point. And then von Clausewitz says, but in fact, however frequent and however important these views of supply may be, the subsistence of the troops always remains a completely different activity from the use of the troops, and the former has only an influence on the latter by its results. Right? This is particularly important because it makes you understand that the results are constantly influenced by the of combat, are constantly influenced by all these factors that derive literally from everywhere. Now we're kind of fixating on supplies, but it can be literally everything. It's like even what kind of clothes you're wearing, what's the weather outside, or what if the enemy is I don't know, is using it's the conduct is using, I don't know, propaganda, audio propaganda, so something like that. I mean, it can be that wide because strategy is massively based, right? That's why it's so massively more difficult than tactics, right? Tactics is relatively easy to understand. Strategy is not, right? Or at least it's much more difficult to sort out. So all these factors obviously influence the results, but they do not influence the way war is conducted theoretically, right? In other words, how a soldier fights in a platoon, let's say, is not theoretically subordinated to how much he has eaten, because that is given as a generic condition that obviously can vary, because it's obvious that if the guy is starving, he cannot even fight, right? But that still pertains to the realm of reality, of course, but not to the theory of the conduct of war. I hope I've been clear enough, because the concept here is very simple, actually, but von Clausewitz is definitely way more effective than it could ever be. He goes on and says, the other branches of administrative activity which we have mentioned stand much farther apart from the use of the troops. Meaning, obviously how the soldier eats is the ultimate end of the supply chain, right? What pertains instead, for example, to the administration, on how, back in the rear lines, beyond the lines, the various the military administration manages the food depots, is obviously something that impacts the results, what happens on the field, but it's farther apart from it, much farther apart from it. So this is a kind of effective example. And even this, von Clausewitz writes, the care of the sick and wounded, highly important as it is for the good of an army, directly affects it only in a small portion of the individuals composing it, and therefore has only a weak and indirect influence upon the use of the rest. It's kind of obvious, right? The way a soldier gets healed is not medically different from how you would heal anyone else. Maybe just the combat medic has to deal with lots of other things surrounding the wounded soldier, and for which he has to be trained in this sense, militarily speaking, in a way that is not different from the soldier himself, obviously. But it's another thing. The way that guys healed has to do with medicine. Hasn't to do with there is naturally a medicine that is specialized in dealing with combat situations, but in this sense it's still about medicine, still how kind of doing what of fixing stuff in an emergential situation, and then bringing the guy to a hospital that is far away where he can get better treatment, right? So this is very important, because obviously let's say an average civilian doctor would have quite of a trouble to heal a soldier on the battlefield, right? So he could be the best doctor in the world, but he may not be the best military man in the world, so at that point he may be too scared even to come out. So that's why combat medics are trained where they are, right? And in this sense, I remember, because I was applying for that actually back in the day, and one of the first things the officers told us was, first, in order to become a combat a military doctor, was that you're first a military man and then a doctor. Now this is very, very important if you think about it, because you realize that at that point it's actually more important for you to still be a combatant than a doctor in the first place. So it does make a difference. So at that point it's not even important for you to be kind of the most sophisticated doctor that exists, even if that can't really be useful. First thing, the most important thing is that you can do on the field something that is functional for the field, for that particular environment, right? Then if you can do more, better, but you have to be aware that there are kind of more important things over there, and there are also something that, medically speaking, obviously you can't do in combat, right? It's obvious, and just think about when von Clausewitz writes about how the battlefield really is, how it is to be on a battlefield. In order to carry out certain surgical operations, you have to be pretty damn concentrated, cold-blooded, precise, millimetrically precise. Well, if you're under fire, chances are, and just think about all the instruments, and it's obvious that you can't do much. But still, we're talking about two distinct fields. One is the military one is the medical one, right? In theory, this makes a lot of difference. It's an essential difference. And it's important that here von Clausewitz is stressing the idea that there is a huge impact that even the theory in this case of medicine has on the army, right? Here it says, take care of sick and wounded, highly important as it is for the good of an army. Well, that's pretty damn obvious, right? So he's not overlooking anything here. And he goes on and writes, the completing and replacing articles of arms and equipment, except so far as by the organism of the forces, if it constitutes a continuous activity inherent in them, takes place only periodically and therefore seldom affects strategic plans. It's also very important because it points out a fact that is, let's say, the way even such administrative stuff, let's say, of troop maintenance functions, is like that there's a general resupplying, let's say, at one point, and the troops go on with that. And there is naturally a different logic, for a while, of course, and when they need to be resupplied once again. So there's a logic in here that it means that the theory of maintenance seldom affects strategic plans in the first place, right? Because what happens in terms of resupplying, etc., is something that is basically happening on a different, let's say, on a different channel that is meant to work by itself in a different way, right? So it's really at this point not much of a theoretical difference, but a division of tasks, because the soldier on the front line, as a combatant, does very different stuff from the guy that comes with a truck to bring to them supplies, etc. He can find himself in combat too, but let's say that they're still doing two different things and they're deputed to two different activities. So and they're even meant not to interfere with each other, because there are also logistical difficulties in this sense. Like going out there fighting, it happens in situations where, think about especially, battles in general. I mean, there is a camp you have to set forth from to go fighting. Then you go back to the camp. That's more or less like that. So it's obvious that the camp is chosen, as we were saying before, in a position that has a particular meaning. There's also tactical in many ways. Can be your Alamo in desperate situations, but that's mostly meant to be something else. It has also to rest, the arresting or restoring function for the troops that have to fight somewhere else outside of it, hopefully at least. And this goes along even with supplies, for example, that the same armies bring together with them, right? So the army does travel with supplies. Think about all logistics, how it works, even before, before combustion engine, and normally armies brought everything with them because it was much more functional. Today you can cover much longer distances with vehicles that, in this sense, can really detach spatially the combat ground from, the supply lines and certain logistical centers, camps, etc. It's partly theoretical as a concept, but it's still important because supplies sometimes can have also tactical use. Certain armies, for example, used supplies to deploy them in the rear of the army as an obstacle, so that the troops would be less in the front, would be less eager to flee, to rout, because they would have this obstacle on their back. So yeah, things like this. But in that case, there's still two different things. Like, knowing how to use supplies tactically is not really the best use, because chariots or wagons, etc., are not meant for that. Usually, maybe Haskanussi, he would have a different opinion about that. Combat wagons did exist as well, but there at that point there's still two different things, right? It's like there can be many examples can be. Excuse me, I drink a little bit because I don't feel that well today. In fact, I also speak less effectively than the usual. But it's a bit like, take a Formula 1 car. That's all for speeding, for racing, right? Take, a station wagon. That's for bringing a lot of stuff with you. At that point, it's not about the speed performance, right? So it's a bit like this, like with the military and the maintenance, like the conduct of war and the maintenance of the troops. There are two different things that interfere in each other in practice, in terms of outcomes, of results, but they're not the same thing theoretically, and they don't mingle. They pertain to very different spheres in this sense. So, and here von Clausewitz in fact explains a bit what this relation is in practice. He writes, "We must, however, here guard ourselves against a mistake. In certain cases, these subjects may be really of decisive importance. The distance of hospitals and depots of munition may very easily be imagined as the sole cause of every important strategic decision. We do not wish either to contest that point or to throw it into the shade, but we are at present occupied not with particular facts of a concrete case, but with abstract theory. And our assertion, therefore, is that such an influence is too rare to give the theory of sanitary measures and the supply of munitions and arms an importance in theory of the conduct of war, such as to make it worthwhile to include in the theory of the conduct of war the consideration of the different ways and systems which the above theories may furnish, in the same way as is certainly necessary in regard to victualling troops, right? So the concept is basically the one that we have repeated since the beginning of the video, right? There is this the size and importance of what these these elements that do not pertain to the conduct of war have on the same in terms of outcomes, of results. But they're still, this is a purely theoretical distinction that von Clausewitz is making in this chapter, and that's how we will have to take it, right? So that when you talk about the theory of war, you can't waste time looking at the theory of sanitary measures or the supply of munitions and arms. The conduct of war responds to its own theory, and that's what we are studying, and how that that is important to enucleate as a discipline on its own. This is, in my opinion, very important even for military history in many ways, because military history does suffer sometimes of this misconceptions at the end of the day. Meaning, think about all the people that study, say, where he's a military historian, and what does he study? Effectively, he studies like in fact how armies were supplied. Well, yeah, that's a military historian, but he's not a historian of the military art, that is the conduct of war. Like, he may, a person could study like all his life all the supplying system, all the armies in the world, still not understanding anything about tactics. But it's pretty obvious and pretty evident. So this often happens, right? That's why military history too often becomes either too political or too social, and the really military side of the story is that is the one of the conduct of war, tactically and strategically, is neglected, right? And this is a great problem in my opinion, because what it really takes is to draw, to make really a lot of exercise on how to handle the resources that you have for the objects of war, right? For the how war has to be conducted at the end of the day. So if you don't pose to yourself those problems, and you remain just in the niche of saying, well, I talk about something that is military related, but I don't quite know how an army could be commanded, which kind of tactical, strategical decision I should make in that particular context. Well, at that point, that's a wholly different thing. That's, for example, what this channel is about. It's really studying what should develop a strategical as well as a tactical culture. That obviously, I talk about things that elude that at the same time, because obviously the context is also important. In fact, you can't really learn military history if you presume that you're just going to study battles without knowing anything about, say, philosophy, technology, literature, or geography, languages. You have to know that all, because if you want to be a strategist especially, you have to be, but even as a tactician, you should know all of that, because otherwise you can't take a decision. You couldn't even know the counter and the people you're fighting, right? So it's very important, in my opinion, that von Clausewitz makes this kind of divisions, and they're not banal at all, even though, as he writes at the end, he says, many may find this kind of, why is he talking about this stuff? Well, because it's important to make clarity, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and writes, if we have clearly understood the results of our reflections, then the activities belonging to war divide themselves into two principal classes, into such as are only preparations for war and into the war itself, right? This division must therefore also be made in theory. So, one thing is what enables you to wage war. One thing is waging war, right? They're two separate things. And obviously they happen sometimes on the same time, on the same ground, but they are two different things in theory, and it's important to distinguish them as such. Then von Clausewitz goes on and writes, the knowledge and applications of skill in the preparations for war are engaged in the creation, discipline, and maintenance of all the military forces. What general names should be given to them we do not enter into, but we see that artillery, fortification, elementary tactics, as they are called, the whole organization and administration of the various armed forces and all such things are included, right? Okay, but the theory of war itself occupies itself with the use of these prepared means for the object of war. It's even more poignant as a point, because you would say, tactics at this point are like something that you simply wage. No, there is a theory of that too, there is a preparation for that too, in terms of elementary tactics. What concerns instead the conduct of war, and how you use this prepared means for the object of war, in fact, is a different thing. It's a different side of the story, right? And it's, in fact, an art that develops by itself on a different ground. And von Clausewitz writes, it needs of the first only the results, that is, the knowledge of the principal properties of the means taken in hand for use. In other words, if you want to know how to use, if you want to use artillery, fortification, elementary tactics, you don't have to be necessarily an expert about the single things, but you know how, from the results, you have to gain this knowledge, let's say experience, of how they work together so that you can use them. It's like a big an orchestra conductor, right? He doesn't have to know how all the instruments are played. He doesn't have to be an expert on that ground individually, but he has to know how to put them together. It's like a composer, actually, let's say better, not a conductor proper, but a composer, right? That's the point. That's particularly interesting. And how you can use many things at once in order to make a synthesis and to combine them. And it's a bit similar to what the historian does at the end of the day. And this is not just an anecdotal example, because it's objectively even what the military historian does. He has to take basically everything into consideration of the strictly military, non-military aspects in order to figure out how and why certain things happened, and to make a synthesis out of it. And that's where the practice, the experience also is needed, right? So I think this is important. Von creation is okay. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, it needs of the first, okay, we already read it, excuse me, this we call the art of war in a limited sense, because von Clausewitz, actually, we have seen, in a broader sense, includes maintenance and conduct within the art of war, broadly meant. In a limited sense, the art of war is properly just the conduct. In fact, he says that the art of war, or also named theory of the conduct of war, or theory of the employment of armed forces, right? All of them denoting for us the same thing, So this is an important theoretical principle that cannot be ignored, and it's important because these two elements, in the broader sense of the art of war, go together. Like the maintenance and the conduct is they're all part of the same thing, right? Because historically speaking, I mean, find a military man that accomplished some great military results being just a mere driver, let's say, that simply was put at the head of an army and simply made it win. There's never been such a thing. Every military commander has an understanding of things that are not strictly just related to the conduct of war. It's basically impossible to detach them in reality as we do in theory. But it's still very, very, very important to make this theoretical distinction, because that really makes you understand what makes the difference also between a skilled commander and another one in terms in the various environments, right? You can't be a great planner, great organizer, but a very bad artist of war, right? Very bad commander on the field, and vice versa, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and writes, the present theory will therefore treat the combat as the real contest, marches, camps, and cantonments as circumstances which are more or less identical with it. The subsistence of the troops will only come into consideration like other given circumstances in respect of its results, not as an activity belonging to the combat, right? So there are certain elements that have to do with the maintenance, that like even how let's say that they're operational, let's say, better, but they don't have to do with combat proper, which are marches, camps, and cantonments, etc. But they're closely tied to the tactical and strategical side of the story. Then there are lots of other aspects that concern the subsistence of the troops that have an enormous importance in terms of results on the conduct of war, but they do not affect the conduct of war when it's performed, like during the way combat is directed, right? And in this sense, subsistence of the troops is not an activity belonging to the combat. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the art of war, thus viewed in its limited sense, divides itself again into tactics and strategy. So basically, we have seen with this narrower definition of the art of war dealing with combat, we find tactics and strategy, right, that are kind of still two other separated dimensions, but they still are intertwined, as we've seen. Not differently from the art of war narrowly meant and the subsistence of the troops. They are all tied together. And von Clausewitz writes, the tactics occupies itself with the form of the separate combat, the latter the strategy with its use, right? So that's the definition. Tactics is how you win battles. Strategy deals with the use of combat, right? Where to fight, why to fight, etc. Both, von Clausewitz writes, connect themselves with the circumstances of marches, camps, cantonments only through the combat, and these are circumstances, and these circumstances are tactical or strategic according as they relate to the form or the signification of the battle, right? So the way combat is performed is tactical. What's the meaning of that? The signification that combat pertains to strategy. Von Clausewitz writes, no doubt there will be many readers who will consider superfluous this careful separation of two things lying so close together as tactics and strategy, because it has no direct effect on the conduct itself of war. We admit certainly that it would be pedantry to look for direct effects on the field of battle from a theoretical distinction, right? So for Clausewitz says we're not even interested at this point to go deeper into distinguishing case by case what is of tactical relevance or strategical relevance in reality, right? Because it's obvious that this is impossible at the very end. I mean, you can make a lot of distinction in here, but still, it's more important the wall and how does how tactics and strategy interact together in the conduct of war, in the art of war. So it's not important, but it's still important to know that they're separated, right? So, okay, he goes on and says, but the first business of every theory is to clear up conceptions and ideas which have been jumbled together, and we may say entangled and confused, and only when a right understanding is established as to names and conceptions can we hope to progress with clearness and facility, and be certain that author and reader will always see things from the same point of view, right? This is a very important memento that von Clausewitz writes to reinforce this theoretical, the usefulness of the theoretical distinction, and also to remember to tell the reader that, look, here we must be talking about the same thing, because believe it or not, most of the misconceptions surrounding war and etc., they're not even strictly practical. They're just a matter of definition. Like, if a person uses strategy or tactics improperly, or if it thinks that in this sense the subsistence of the troops is somehow related, and it mixes everything up, and it can cause many ideological distortions. I mean, the point is, you have to make clarity first, then before venturing into the practice, right? Because otherwise you will interpret everything from a distorted perspective, and you will incur into certain mistakes that you could have avoided simply by reflecting on what we're talking about. So this is very important, because it's like when you read something, you listen to something, and you tell the first thing that comes into your mind, just because you feel, I don't know, maybe you want to fit in, and then you ruin it, because maybe you haven't even understood what the whole deal is about. And this happens a lot when, just taking von Clausewitz as an example, as an author, as a thinker. You know, how many people do study von Clausewitz, or how many people do understand him, even by knowing who he is, because that's also a very important side of the story. This whole thing is sometimes I'm really shocked to see that of all the subscribers I have now, when I make a von Clausewitz video, like, you know, I have several tens watching every video, especially if it's about history. Every time I make a von Clausewitz video, over 700 followers, I have like 2 views. The last one from 3 days ago, 2 views, right? Well, I get, usually here I see 250 views a day on other videos, like that are basically not von Clausewitz. So the lack of interest towards this thinker is the brightest example of this, and for not talking about his misunderstanding, right? If you presume that every kind of object that enters into your intellectual sphere is just a thing that you have to use to make yourself feel better by criticizing it without understanding it, well, you will probably not progress much in your life. If you don't challenge yourself, if you pretend you're kind of more intelligent than anyone else, then you're done with. basically. You're just spinning around. You don't go anywhere. Von Clausewitz is a dramatically sophisticated and evoluted thinker that tells you things how they work, guiding you into them, not like, making some effect phrases like, that deal with the emotional side of the story or to flatter you, etc. Well, it simply tells you how things work. If you want to listen and try to apply yourself, because it's not just a matter of listening, you should really put your mind into this stuff in order to make something out of it. Because otherwise, and this is so meaningful in many ways, because it makes you realize that the problem with intelligence is not just a matter of effective contact, of learning. It's a matter of being able to process certain stuff, to read through it and understand its deeper meaning. If you're just exposed to such material and then you basically don't learn anything else about it, because you think it's just what you read, there is no real point even of reading anything, unless, that usually brings you to function on a little bit better at one point. But this is maybe just a ramble. But it's important to read, to study this work, bearing in mind that there is a very specific clarity in its message. It's not something you don't even need to search for it, really. It's already here. It already works by itself, by reading it and understanding what it's written in here. It's not a matter of interpretation. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of, here I may have a different opinion because I'm vain enough to think that I'm better than this guy. It's essentially a humbling experience to study von Clausewitz, because at the end of the day there is no alternative to what he says, simply because you get to the point that this was a genius in its truest meaning, and without anyone needing to really, here it's the message that matters. When you read something, I hope at least you read it thinking about what it's written, not who wrote it. Like, it's obvious that if you read the opinion of an important political, let's say, of a person that is famous because of for his opinion, well, then you probably already want to, well, it depends on how that opinion is built. Obviously, if it's a scientific opinion, it's different from a political opinion, for example, usually. But I say usually, giving the benefit of the doubt that even such a distinction is necessary sometimes, because I think that we should reason kind of scientifically speaking, and von Clausewitz does reason in this scientific way, because he makes some certain points that are evidently driven by kind of a scientific interest in here. Here, he's not making morals. He's not talking morals. He's not, even though he's giving pretty damn effective moral advice in here, or moral teachings in the measure in which, what you can learn from what reality works like, which is something you can do even through science at the end of the day. I mean, it makes a lot of difference to in someone's life to accept, I don't know, the principles of thermodynamics. That's something that impacts your whole life once you rationalize it, once you acknowledge it. Well, that has a big impact, right? So von Clausewitz concludes by saying, "He to whom all this is nothing, must either repudiate all theoretical consideration, or his understanding has not as yet been pained by the confused and perplexing ideas, resting on no fixed point of view, leading to no satisfactory result, sometimes dull, sometimes fantastic, sometimes floating in vague generalities, which we are often obliged to hear and read on the conduct of war, owing to the spirit of scientific investigation having either to being little directed to these subjects. This is one of the most beautiful phrases. This is where really von Clausewitz makes you understand his power like a thinker. Here it says, either you dislike theory, which is a pretty wishful thinking, meaning that, it's not that theory is something that you really can dismiss by thinking, okay, well, I don't care because this is just, I like practice. Good luck with that. All practice and no theory. Where are you standing on? And when he says, the other option is that, which is basically the same person at the end of the day, is that you still haven't come to terms with what has been explained either to, and that has chosen to be based on basically on nothing, because here it says on no fixed point of view, leading in fact to no satisfactory result. So always thinking there is another option, and says sometimes it's dull, sometimes it's fantastic, sometimes it's floating in vague generalities, like, what are you really concerned on? Because concerned about, because what's the alternative that you choose to what we have discussed now up to this point since the beginning, since the very beginning of the Vom Kriege, right? If you want to provide a different model, a different theory, well, show us, right? And it turns out there's no other way to make it, right? And this is all very, very you should be very, very careful before even presuming that you can try to check von Clausewitz. Like, the context here doesn't really matter. Here it doesn't matter where you come from, or what opinions you hold, or what kind of ideals you have. Here, try to read this book and put yourself to the test and see how open-minded you can be about, how flexible, how adaptive, how intelligent you can be. Because this book really gives you pretty direct and straight and solid basis. These are bases, really, because eventually we have seen that there is no science, right, to apply here. There is not a science of war. There is just a certain system that is a theoretical system that, however, gives you the best results possible, given the impossibility of solving the situation, whichever it is, because there is no mathematical way to solve such systems in absolute terms. And it takes a lot. It takes a lifetime spent in war, like von Clausewitz one was. It takes the massive study of military history, which von Clausewitz did in an enormous amount. That would be even embarrassing to tell what it was, and one day we'll talk about it. So yes, this is very important, and what I would say is that consider von Clausewitz. I mean, if you're really interested in military history, really interested, and we all know what the interest here is, we don't care about our national backgrounds. We don't care about whose team we don't really want to understand how things went, because this is at the end of the day our utmost desire. Well, if you are just like this, just study this book, because this book has really the answer to what you're searching for real, without no jokes, with all cards uncovered. Like here from Clausewitz demonstrates everything step by step, and it's very practical, it's very clear. It doesn't mock you, he doesn't underestimate your intelligence. He understands what you are into, and he guides you through that. So it's exceptional, and I would love to spend many other words about this, but the important is the concept. And we will have definitely more than one chance, I hope at least, to expand these thoughts by continuing to read and commenting on the Vom Kriege. So for today, everything is fine. Sorry if today was a bit more clumsy than the usual. I have some kind of physical pain now, and it's I even can't sit straight at this point. But I hope to get better, and I was a bit confused, also have other problems, but I hope to get better soon, and that also influences my speaking capabilities, but whatever. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.